Welcome to this presentation about competency-based education. My name is Mike Dillon, and I am an instructional designer here at Kirkwood Community College. I will be walking you through some of the basic concepts associated with competency-based education. During this presentation, we will address the objectives outlined on the screen. In particular, we will review Kirkwood's definition of competency-based education. We will also look at some of the key elements of a competency-based approach, talk a bit about program and course design, and identify some of the policy and logistical implications associated with implementing a competency-based approach. So, what is competency-based education? Competency-based education is a bit of a nebulous concept because there is no single, clear-cut definition that exists. Every institution defines CBE a little bit differently, and Kirkwood is no exception. Kirkwood's definition is shown on the screen. There are three key themes highlighted in this definition. First, high-level expectations are set and held for all students. This theme is often referred to as holding the learning constant. Second, authentic assessments are used to measure proficiency and to determine student learning. Third, and finally, student learning experiences are personalized. To find out more, you are welcome to view a video summary of the white paper that outlines Kirkwood's definition. It is important to note that Kirkwood's definition of competency-based education is purposely broad. The college serves a diverse community and does so using a diverse set of programs, content areas, and modalities. A broad definition of CBE makes it possible to apply the concepts in many different ways. An important thing to note, though, is that employing a competency-based approach has the effect of flipping the traditional model of teaching and learning. As you can see, changing the perspective by simply holding the learning constant has a big impact on how learning is approached and gets us away from the more traditional model where learning is allowed to vary and where students have relatively uniform educational experiences. Changing the perspective has a ripple effect on everything that we do. This list represents just a few of the many questions that come up when we talk about implementing a competency-based approach. Although these questions are challenging and do not have simple answers, they are important questions to ask. When making the decision to implement competency-based concepts, one of the biggest challenges is figuring out how to implement the concepts within the confines of a traditional structure. Before we dig into this question, though, let's shift gears a bit. I'd like to mention a few places where competency-based concepts are currently being applied here at Kirkwood. Competency-based education is not a new concept, so it is not uncommon to see elements of the approach being implemented in different ways. Here are a few places around Kirkwood where competency-based concepts are surfacing. What is particularly interesting is that just within the confines of Kirkwood, competency-based approaches are taking on a variety of different forms. In culinary arts, for instance, the capstone course is competency-based. The modality is face-to-face, and the logistics of the program put relatively tight time constraints on the faculty and the students. Yet, the learning is still held constant. On the other hand, work is currently underway to build a competency-based management program that is self-paced and completely online. These two unique examples demonstrate how the same CBE concepts can be applied in very different ways, even within the same institution. So, what are some of the common elements that unify different competency-based approaches? Backward design is one of the most important things that supports the development of competency-based courses and programs. Backward design is a three-stage process that starts with the end in mind. This philosophy or theory helps to drive the development process and provides a solid framework for creating high-quality, competency-based courses and programs. The three stages of the backward design process are laid out in such a way as to ensure that the targeted learning is clearly identified, appropriately worked toward, and accurately assessed. We are talking about competency-based education, so it would seem natural that competencies are an important element to highlight. When it comes down to it, the competencies are the backbone of a competency-based approach. Competencies must be clearly articulated, they must be measurable and observable, and as prescribed by the backward design theory, they must be formulated at the beginning of the design process. Well-written competencies are the key to a successful competency-based approach. Taking the time to craft the competencies is essential to assuring that implementation of competency-based concepts is built on a solid foundation. Another common element that is found when utilizing a competency-based approach is the use of authentic assessments. Assessment is a critical piece of the competency-based puzzle, and it is important that assessments authentically measure student learning. The importance of authenticity cannot be stressed enough, and this is why the role of authentic assessments is highlighted in Kirkwood's definition of CBE. Defining proficiency is another key element of a competency-based approach. Determining what is considered to be proficient with regard to learning and/or performance is important, and it is critical that the required level of proficiency is clearly communicated to students. What is considered to be proficient is often different from one course to the next, and differences might exist even within the same course. The important thing to remember is that the defined level of proficiency needs to be justifiable to all stakeholders. To give you some idea about what proficiency might look like, some common examples of proficiency levels are listed on the screen. In general, proficiency is often equated to B-level work in a traditional grading system. When thinking about proficiency, a question that often comes up centers around what to do if a student does not demonstrate proficiency. Related to that question involves determining what plans are in place for reteaching, reassessing, and resubmission. We touch on this topic a little bit more later on. Ultimately, it is important to set learning expectations high and to hold those expectations for all students so that the learning is held constant. As was noted earlier, implementing a competency-based approach flips the traditional model for teaching and learning. Therefore, there are implications for program and course design. What are some of those implications? Assessment is one area that is affected when using a competency-based approach. One of the keys to ensuring that assessments accurately reflect student learning and shows that students have demonstrated proficiency on the targeted competencies is using assessments that are authentic. This means that the assessments need to align with the competencies in terms of cognitive demand, rigor, and relevance to real-world applications. Both objective and performance-based assessments can be used to assess student learning, but the choice of which type of assessment to use should be carefully considered. In many situations, performance-based assessments serve as the most authentic way to measure proficiency of the targeted competencies. When performance-based assessments are used, rubrics are generated to guide the evaluation process. Analytic rubrics, like the one shown here, provide the necessary details to both students and instructors for outlining expectations and for ensuring that the evaluation is as consistent and objective as possible. As you can see, the levels of the rubric are not always numerical or aligned to a letter grade. An example of a rating scale that can be used for the rubrics and for communicating student progress is shown here. In order to pass an assessment, a student usually needs to meet all of the criteria outlined in the rubric at their proficient level. If some aspect of the work is not reflecting proficiency, then the work is often returned to the student with feedback so that revisions can be made to improve the artifact. Another thing that is influenced when implementing a competency-based approach is grading. As you could see by the previous rubric example, communicating about learning progress often takes the form of feedback and verbal ratings, like exceeds or proficient or approaching, rather than using points, percentages, or letter grades. Since competency-based approaches are often implemented within the context of a traditional structure, we are usually required to assign some type of letter grade to communicate what a student has achieved. So this raises the question of how do you translate proficiency into a letter grade? One approach is to modify the grading scale so that the assigned letter grades reflect proficiency. One example is to use an A, B, I, F grading scale. An A corresponds to exceeding proficiency, a B corresponds to meeting proficiency, and incompletes and Fs are assigned when a student has not yet reached the proficient level. In general, an F is only used if a student has exhausted all efforts to demonstrate proficiency. Translating the language of proficiency into letter grades can be tricky, and a variety of questions often come up when thinking about assigning grades. A few of these questions are shown here. These are questions that you may have to address when developing a course or a program, so it is important to carefully consider how you might handle the grading process. The question of resubmission and reassessment came up earlier in the presentation. What happens if a student does not pass an assessment at the required level of proficiency? One characteristic of a competency-based approach deals with allowing students to resubmit artifacts or reassess skills in order to demonstrate proficiency. The personalized nature of a competency-based approach is often based on the fact that students learn at different rates and often require different experiences as part of their learning. If a student does not get a concept the first time or does not initially master a particular skill, then what happens next? A competency-based approach is all about giving students the necessary time and support to understand concepts and develop skills. Therefore, having opportunities to reassess is essential. Reassessing, though, does not necessarily mean that students should just test over and over again. Policies and procedures need to be established to ensure that the reassessment process is fair and efficient and promotes continued learning and growth. Feedback is an important piece of the assessment process. Feedback is one of the primary vehicles for communication during the assessment process. Feedback is particularly important in helping to guide students through the steps when reassessment is necessary. Therefore, crafting good feedback is a skill that instructors need to develop in order for a competency-based approach to be successful. Another implication associated with using a competency-based approach involves pacing. One of the hallmarks of a competency-based approach is that students are often allowed to work at their own pace. Although the ideal situation would be for students to take as much time as they need to demonstrate proficiency, there are often time-based constraints that affect the pace at which students are able to work. Various logistics associated with terms, satisfactory academic progress, financial aid, and so on all influence the actual amount of time that is available for students to learn concepts and develop skills. In many competency-based courses, specific due dates for assignments and assessments are often eliminated, and students are allowed to work through the material as they see fit. Given the fact that there is often a hard deadline at the end of a term, students do need to develop some type of plan to ensure that they get work completed within the time constraints. One way that instructors can support students in developing appropriate timelines and in setting an appropriate pace for completing work is to provide students with a pacing guide. Time management in a competency-based course or program is critical, and pacing guides can help students set reasonable goals for meeting the learning expectations. A final point to think about when considering some of the implications associated with implementing a competency-based approach is the role of students' prior experience. Leveraging prior work and life experience often allows students to customize their learning experience. It is important to consider how a student's prior experience might influence their learning in a particular course or program. Some examples of how a student might leverage his or her prior experience are listed on the screen. In general, it is important to clearly articulate to students how they can use their prior learning experiences to move through a particular course or program. In many cases, accelerating through content to get to the assessment for a targeted competency is the primary way that prior experiences can be utilized. As we have seen, implementing a competency-based approach to teaching and learning influences a variety of things when it comes to specific courses and programs. Articulating competencies, assessment, grading, resubmission, pacing, and so on must be addressed in order to ensure that the learning experience is smooth and seamless for the students. There are many other aspects of the overall structure of a competency-based program that are also affected and must be addressed. Here are a few questions that need to be addressed when implementing a competency-based approach. There are no easy answers to these questions, but they are things that need to be addressed, often at an institution level, to ensure that students and all stakeholders benefit from the advantages of competency-based education. So what does the future of competency-based education look like at Kirkwood? As noted earlier in the presentation, there are already some things happening that involve competency-based approaches. In terms of future development, the hope is to start developing some programs that are competency-based. A competency-based version of the business management program is being created, and some interest is starting to brew for several programs in industrial technology. As competency-based education begins to gain a foothold here at Kirkwood, the plan is to develop the necessary structure to ensure consistency across programs. In the end, the goal is for certain programs to offer competency-based opportunities so the students have more options for successfully completing their degrees. If you are looking to learn more about competency-based education, there are many different resources available online that you can explore. Here are the websites for some institutions that are known for offering competency-based programs. Reviewing their websites might be useful in helping you develop a better sense of how competency-based education can be operationalized. There are also several websites dedicated to promoting the concept of competency-based education. These are a few websites that are worth exploring to learn more about CBE. Kirkwood also has some resources that are available to help you better understand competency-based education. The training opportunities are probably your best bet for learning about what Kirkwood has to offer. I am also the resident CBE expert, and I am glad to answer any questions that you have. If you have any questions about competency-based education, please be sure to ask. There are a variety of channels through which you can contact me if you need any assistance or just want to find out more about competency-based education. Feel free to email, call me, or stop by my office. Thank you for taking time to watch this presentation.